We're here with Payne Chevelle at 71 Blandford Street to talk to the landscape artist Louise Cattrell about the places that inspire her work.
This is Sandstell. This is one of a series of large paintings I made at the Berwick Gymnasium Gallery, where I did a residency, where you actually had the entire gymnasium, so I could actually put out all my work in one particular place, which is incredibly unusual. As you can see, they are quite large. Sandstell refers to places within the estuary of the Tweed where it meets the North Sea, where the salmon fishers used to hold the salmon in various places before they would then put it on the trains to come south. It's a very turbulent part of where the sea meets the Tweed, and in fact while I was there, one of the beaches actually was completely swept away. It had big tides there. For those of you who haven't been through Berwick-upon-Tweed on the train up to Edinburgh, there's a very long pier that goes right out into the North Sea, and you can literally hang over the edge and be part of the sea. So it was incredible. It was a very important development for me, spending 3 months in Berwick, having the space and the time to really become part of that landscape. When I make work, I don't use photography. I've got nothing against photography. What I do is, the experience of landscape is very important, and I spend a lot of time walking in the landscape, absorbing it, remembering it. I think you can use your memory to create that experience of being in the landscape, the 360-degree panorama of what that means. And that also includes the quality of sound and the weather. You won't find very many references to man-made objects in my work, because that's one of the illusions I want to give you, is the fact that you can be within the landscape and have no idea of what time it is in terms of reference to either the century or the day. Although perhaps you can tell what the weather was like on that particular time. I build the work up very slowly. The paint is akin to watercolour in thickness. I don't use oil anymore. They're all on linen. Why I find this useful is it's very fine and very responsive to applying the paint. It's something almost intangible. You'd have to try and do it yourself to notice the difference between painting on linen or painting on canvas, or wood for that matter, which I have done in the past. I use a very particular turps, which really fines down the paint and yet does not leave a residue and creates a very marvellous fluid liquidity, which I then build up to create paintings like this.
You work a lot in different places. You've been on various residencies to quite disparate locations. How do you differentiate the colours? Do you make a different palette for each place?
So it's a very interesting question. I'm reminded of each of those individual places and what it felt like to be there, and that's what I'm trying to convey. I've been lucky enough to do residencies in places as diverse as Sri Lanka, Bulgaria, Switzerland in particular was a huge influence on me, and often it's not so much the colour as the tonal contrast or lack of, which really distinguishes how the colour is then built up. I think one of the interesting things about landscape is the experience of whether or not you are looking always towards the horizon. One inevitably does that to distinguish where you are, and I'm trying to position myself with the viewer in that place for them to experience as much as I can what I see or feel about the place. This painting is Berg. It was made after I'd come back from Switzerland, doing a residency of 6 weeks in a place called Sierre, which is in the Rhone Valley and very close to Zermatt. It's a very small town, and it's where French-speaking stops and the next town German-speaking starts. So there was quite a dichotomy between the people who lived there. It was also where the mountains came sheer down to the Rhone, so it took quite a while for the light each morning to actually appear. I was there between October and November and kept on hoping I was actually going to see some snow, and never really did. But you would see things like the morning sun literally hit and create a rosy fingered dawn on the side of the mountains. While I was there, I was told by some of the people who were considered vrais Suisses that in fact none of the Zermatt or all the skiing towns were quite right. And I was actually to go on the famous post bus up on the opposite side from Sierre to Chandelin or Chandelin, which was an old-fashioned Swiss village, which was so difficult to get to. They really hadn't transformed it into a Swiss resort yet. So very, very close to the end of my residency, I went up on this bus, and there are some very famous turners of Hannibal going through the Alps, and it certainly felt like that because it was absolutely sheer on either side, and I kept having to move seats. Having got to this extraordinary place, I then walked off into the woods, which I happened to know there was a looking viewpoint out over to the Bernese Oberland. And I was literally trudging, because there was snow up there, that turquoise snow where it has that amazing, fabulous colour. And I had it all to myself, and I went out and stood on this amazing viewpoint where there was nothing between me and an enormous space looking out towards the Bernese Oberland. And this is what this painting was afterwards. It made one of the most significant memories I've ever had of a place. As you can see, in contrast to the other works, the tonal range of this is much more dramatic. The fact that the inaccessibility of it made it yet more elusive. Borders and where things meet, for me, are whether it's the sky meeting the sea, or river, or mountain, or hill. It's always that edge, and you always know there's something beyond it, that thing of walking up a hill and knowing there will always be yet another point where you've got to before you get to the top. And it's that excitement when things meet, and it's often so fleeting. That's what I like so much about not referencing something that's man-made. It's the fact that you have this one unique day or month or whatever where you're part of an immensely changing weather system, and how that completely transforms or obfuscates the landscape you're looking at.
In some of your works, you actually amalgamate different memories from different places, is that right?
Very much so, and obviously the experience of one feeds into the next. One particular painting here, Tower, is about being in Portugal and seeing an extraordinary collection of refugees that were literally up a very steep hill with a convent at the top. And they were all sited slightly different, so nobody could actually see anybody else when they were in that. And then it became very much more reminiscent of a place called Smailholm Tower, which is in the Scottish borders, which is just a very straight-up tower, defensive tower, which has great echoes, and it's a very strange place, very evocative. So these two things came together, one from Portugal. They all felt as if they were looking into the distance.
Do you see the landscapes as portraits in a way of the places?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of describing them, because they are not just about the landscape, they are about the interaction of the artist and the viewer who comes to see them. So that idea of the person in the place becomes almost like a reverse portrait.
How do you go about capturing the enormity of the sky and the sea and the mountains when you're working on a smaller scale like this?
That was one of the challenges I set myself many years ago, was to create the largest amount of distance I could on the smallest canvas, using tone to suggest that distance and the void. And since then I have tried to work with that idea. This painting, Tower, which is one I was talking about when the refugees, as it were, of Portugal, which would have originally gone up and down here, you can see how much the painting has actually changed. And this is now referencing Smailholm Tower and the borders. But there is still the quality of seeing that extraordinary Portuguese hillside. This one created a huge amount of aggravation for me, and it took me about 3 months to make, using very, very, very thin layers and scraping them off and scraping them off.
Do you have an idea before you start how it's going to end up, or is it totally a chance process of memories cropping up and being incorporated?
For me, the great magic is when you have presented with the white canvas. Lots of people say, oh, that's hideously anxiety making, but for me it's where the potential is at its fullest. The minute I start painting on it, that diminishes and reduces and reduces. So it almost takes on its own authorship, but it's me being part of that authorship. And sometimes I really have to fight enormously to get the painting the way I want it to be. It all sounds very romantic, and I suppose it is, that you had this dialogue with this piece of canvas on a wooden frame. But for me, that's what I do, and it's enormously powerful for me when I can make it work.
And how do you know when the painting is finished?
I can't answer that one. There is that point where you just know. I often then take it from the studio and put it somewhere where I can see it in another room. And until I have to stop looking at it and thinking, no, there's something I haven't completed, then it will go back into the studio until that time has come where I don't see anything other than what it is.